The title, Blue Veins and Brown Bags, comes from a lot of the practices and things that were happening, particularly in countries like the United States. Context, though, I'm going to step back just a little bit and talk about the context for blue vein societies and brown paper bag tests. So during slavery, the children of white colonists, white male colonists, and black women, enslaved black women, were, aka mixed race, and they were more likely to be manumitted or to gain their freedom. They were more likely to be given education, and they were more likely to be able to learn a trade or to be taught a trade. And so these advantages that existed during slavery created a large community, well, large relative to what, right? But a growing community of free people of color or freed black people who were largely, and not entirely, but largely mixed race and lighter skinned. And so that was happening during slavery, right? You did have some black people who were free, who were able to own land or do work for pay. And so that privilege sort of compounded for generations after slavery, right? And so there's a period right after slavery and just before Jim Crow called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was like a little slice of the historical timeline that came after slavery and came just before Jim Crow. And a lot of I'm not a historian, by the way, so just full transparency, I'm not up here trying to act like a historian. I am just reporting back to you the history that I have studied and read and heard over the many years. But a lot of the historians say that Jim Crow segregation and the really was backlash and was a result of the progress that black people were starting to make during the period of Reconstruction. So historians have noted that right after slavery, during Reconstruction, a lot of black Americans were being elected into office, were seeing quote unquote progress, were getting wins, were advancing their cause. But what we also know is that those black Americans who were seeing that progress were overwhelmingly mixed race and lighter skin. So during Reconstruction, we talk about how there seemed to be hope and progress and advancement for black Americans. But we have to acknowledge that that was primarily and largely lighter skinned black Americans, mixed race individuals. And so then Jim Crow comes along because, white folks were like, oh, let people free and leave them alone and they actually can thrive. So they're like, we can't have that. So let's, insert other laws and other practices. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, all these types of things came to try to suppress and further subjugate and further oppress black people after slavery, right? But again, these black Americans, again, largely the descendants of mixed ancestry, because they had been set up prior to and generations previously in terms of more access to education, more access to being able to earn a trade, more likely to have come from free families, etc. It was them who were seeing that progress. And so this generational privilege, right, this generational advantage has compounded and still persists in many ways today. But what happened, though, is that these communities of light-skinned people started to intentionally associate themselves with each other. And they started to intentionally try to move up the social ladder. They started to intentionally try to gain status, right? They're like, okay, now we're getting more freedoms. We are seeing more acceptance into universities, more acceptance into the workforce, all these different things. And so they were eager to assimilate. They were eager to advance their cause. But they did so at the expense and to the exclusion of darker skinned and non-mixed African Americans or Black Americans. And part of the societies that they created included not just social networks, but actual social organizations, social clubs, social institutions, schools, even at the university level, fraternities and sororities, churches, neighborhoods, right? Events. There's an entire culture, like entire well-resourced communities of primarily mixed race and lighter skinned Black Americans. And so they intentionally started to carve out their own lane, like a middle class of people that was not Black, not like other dark skinned Black Americans or Negroes, right? To use language from that time period. But they weren't white. They weren't at the status of white people in society, but they were able to carve out their own lane somewhere in the middle of that, right? And part of that effort, part of that intentional class, social class building included things like blue vein societies. So the Blue Vein Society is just one of many institutions, organizations, social phenomena that happened in terms of the realm of what I'm talking about. And so a Blue Vein Society is reported to be a group of people where your skin had to be light enough for the blue veins underneath your skin to be visible. The veins that were blue had to be visible in order for you to be seen as an appropriate member of their community. And they also used the brown paper bag test. And that meant that your complexion had to be lighter than a brown paper bag in order to become a member of their organization or their club or their church, to attend their event, whatever it was, right? And a similar test that wasn't based on complexion, but that was an early version of texturism, was the comb test. And I talked about the comb test before as well, where they had to be able to pass a fine-tooth comb through your kitchen, through the back of your hair without it getting caught, right? In order to determine the appropriateness of your entrance into their societies and communities. And so there's been some debate about how widespread these practices and these so-called tests were, right? There are people who even say, oh, it's all, anecdotal evidence, or there's no, empirical data, that sort of thing. But what we see is that whether there was an actual or literal paper bag present, that the ideology still manifested, that the mindset, the mentality was still there, and it was evident in the makeup of these communities. It was evident in the makeup of these organizations and these societies. They even had their own marriage market, right? In order to, again, hoard and reserve more status, more capital for themselves, for their families, for their descendants, right? So they were very particular about who they let their children marry or associate with, right? And the reality is that even now, that mentality still exists. You might not have a literal blue vein society, but you still have people that are Black people, Black Americans, who are exclusionary, classist, colorists towards other Black Americans, right? And so that practice did not vanish overnight. Because people say, oh, is that still happening? Does that still happen? Is that just a thing of the past? So that's why I go back to my comment about the fact that people who were doing that, a lot of them are still alive, right? Or a lot of them are the children of people who were leaders in those efforts, in those initiatives. And so we can't expect that that would just vanish and disappear into thin air without proactive accountability, proactive reparations, proactive reconciliation, right? And so just because we've ignored it, just because we have not acknowledged it to a degree that I think we should, doesn't mean that it's just going to somehow dissipate or disintegrate on its own. There were exceptions made, that sometimes you would see a darker skinned or a more brown skinned person who was not of mixed ancestry moving through these communities, being accepted or embraced into these groups and organizations. And so exceptions were made based on wealth. So again, this is an intersectional issue, as all issues are. If you were darker skinned, but you were able to save money or earn money and grow your wealth, then a lot of times people were willing to associate with you or have you be a part of their community. But again, the goal is social capital. The goal is how can we increase our social status? And there was a book by Matthew Knowles. So I don't know the man, right? Regardless of what you think of him or his family. His first person narrative is that he was only allowed into his university, his black university, because he was an athlete, right? So he's a dark-skinned person, and he talked about how most of the students at his HBCU were fair-skinned. And he said he was allowed in because he played sports. He played basketball, right? And so that's very similar to what we see a lot of white schools do with their athletes, right? We don't necessarily have a diverse student body, but the black students that we do have, we recruit them specifically to boost or build up our athletic programs, right? I saw that a lot even in high schools back in my hometown in Baton Rouge. So I'm saying all this, and it goes back to the importance of recognizing this and acknowledging this, is it goes back to my comment about the feigned innocence that many light-skinned people have or assert, as if they are light-skinned people collectively are innocent, unassuming bystanders who just can't fathom how or why this colorism thing exists, right? And how, a lot of them, and maybe because the light-skinned people who follow me might sincerely feel this way, but the reality is that this blue vein society, the paper bag test, the whole, let's create a separate middle class just for us, wealthy, elite, some might say bourgeoisie, black people who were disproportionately of mixed ancestry and light-skinned. A lot of that is intentional. And it's not just, we're so sad that these white people see us as more approachable. And we're so sad that white people think we're more intelligent than our darker skinned people. Like, no, these entire communities of light skinned people were actively leveraging that colorism. They were actively leveraging anti-blackness for their own benefit so that they could gain more capital, so that they could assimilate or gain more social status, right? Okay, so let's look at questions now. Mark Mikey says, given the history of how light-skinned or mixed-race people were in the past, as you outlined it, how do you feel about the opposite today who seem to align with dark-skinned, non-mixed people and tend to be loud and vocal today? That's a good question. So a couple of things. One, we talk about how the civil rights movement, a lot of civil rights leaders were also of mixed ancestry and lighter skinned, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, the Kathleen Cleavers, Malcolm X, right? And so one, in the fight for racial justice, in the fight for racial equality, because the reality is that even though they were trying to carve out this separate middle class for themselves and throwing dark-skinned people under the bus to do so, they were still facing racism. Like, they were still barred from a lot of opportunities. And so for some, it behooved them to unite with all Black people to end Jim Crow, right? As long as Jim Crow existed, they were still limited in terms of how much they could assimilate, right? Or gain access to spaces and to things. And so a lot of light-skinned people saw the benefit of fighting for racial justice and racial equality, right? And that's why I don't prioritize fighting racism over colorism. Because what I think, I can't remember where I posted this, but when we focus on racism, then we are creating an opportunity for a different cohort of light-skinned people to rise to power, right? But also I think there are light-skinned people who exist in the world who understand what colorism is and who understand that they're privileged by it, right? And who don't consciously subscribe to it. And I say consciously because we can all still have conditioning and implicit biases and implicit conditioning. But there are light-skinned people today who understand colorism and who are actively trying to respond to it in their way, right? Okay, so a few things could be going on with that. So it seems as though it's an attempt to retroactively make amends for things in the past that have already occurred, but not necessarily engaging with the compounded privilege that manifests today. Yeah, mark my keys. Yes, that's true. So sometimes it's still a selfish motive in terms of if we join together to fight racism and conveniently kind of like ignore colorism, then I'm in an even better position, right? But also what you're saying is there are some people who, again, understand their privilege, understand their historical privilege, and are trying to respond to that in their way. But I like that you use the word compounded privilege, because someone mentioned this and my explanation is longer than I planned it to be. I'm coming to y'all, LinkedIn and YouTube, okay? So if you have a question, hold tight. I'm coming to y'all. I was giving a presentation and I used Kamala Harris as an example of light-skinned privilege. Regardless of, what category or racial category she uses or that you might use for her, she has light-skinned privilege, right? And so someone said, oh, well, it's not light-skinned privilege because she wasn't running against any dark-skinned women. She wasn't running against dark-skinned women, so she wasn't chosen above a dark-skinned candidate, right? But my explanation was that, well, privilege is not just about that individual instance. It's her entire lifetime of having greater access that put her in that position in the first place, that allowed her to enter the room, to even be considered for the vice presidency, was an accumulation of privileged moments, of advantages, of benefits that she has gotten accumulated over the span of her whole lifetime, right? So even just looking at one person and the compounding effect of their privilege over their lifetime, much less the compounding impact of privilege across generations. Your homework, since we've been talking about the history of colorism, in this week's time period, there are still a lot of people alive from this time period. So I want you, for your homework, to talk to someone from a different generation than you about colorism. That could be an older generation or a younger generation, right? But try to find someone from a different generation than you and ask them what their observations were, what their experiences of colorism, what it was like to live in their skin tone during that time period. And then your affirmation is, I take responsibility for my legacy. I choose to be remembered as someone who stood for justice. I'm glad that you start your weeks off every Monday right here with me having this very important conversation on colorism. Love y'all.